I have the fires of Mount Doom behind me, which is in a sense doomsday. From Matthew, then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Mount Doom, The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien writes to someone, responds to a letter, and says Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely as an instrument of providence, and had produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. Frodo brings himself to the crack of Mount Doom, the crack of doom. His humility with which he began and his sufferings were justly rewarded by the highest honor, and his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum gained him mercy. His failure was redressed. He's talking about the apparent failure of Frodo at the climax of this epic. But he goes on to talk about this apparent failure. He doesn't consider it a moral failure. Why? We are finite creatures with absolute limitations upon the powers of our soul-body structure in either action or endurance. Moral failure can only be asserted, I think, when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. In 1984, the horribly disturbing end of that novel comes about because the hero is placed in a position beyond his limits. It's not really a failure. He lets himself down, he lets down the woman he loves, but it's because he can do nothing else. Elsewhere in this letter, Tolkien talks about how if Frodo had been physically prevented from achieving the quest by being killed or crushed by a rock or attacked by Gollum, we wouldn't blame him. When he's psychologically prevented from fulfilling the quest, we tend to blame him, but we don't understand that we are limits. As Tolkien says, we are finite creatures with absolute limitations upon the powers of our soul-body structure in either action or endurance. Our soul-body structure means the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We are composed of both these things, something material and something not material, something spiritual. We can aspire on the one hand spiritually and fall on the other hand physically. Not just physically, but the flesh, sarx as Paul calls it, has its limits. This is why we must be humble. This is why all that garbage that is spewed forth by Christopher West and the theology of the body, saying that you will have eyes that are redeemed and you can participate in a kind of redeemed existence, and you no longer have to practice custody of the eyes, and you can stare at naked people without your concupiscence being aroused. All that nonsense, which ignores that we are finite creatures with absolute limitations upon the powers of our soul-body structure in either action or endurance. All we can do is place ourselves at the limit. Because ultimately it's God's grace, which compels us and which helps us complete when we're no longer able to the task before us. The disciples fall asleep. They fall asleep when they should be awake and consoling and accompanying our Lord in his agony. Yes, that's not good, but it's difficult to judge them for that. Given who they were and where they were and what they understood and thought, how could we have done any more? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Lord, strengthen me in spirit and in flesh.